Good morning. Attorney Chris Candon will now start the presentation.
Thank you, Kelly. My name is Chris Candon. I'm a corporate attorney with Sheehan Finney, specializing in corporate restructuring, creditors' rights, and commercial bankruptcy matters. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by John Gilbert of Synchrony Advisors. Welcome to all of our attendees. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today in our series addressing the COVID-19 crisis. We hope that you are all doing well and are staying safe. A few preliminary items. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website afterwards. In case you missed them, previous webinars are posted on the site already, and we have more webinars scheduled in upcoming days, including a webinar this Friday at 11 a.m. when employment lawyers Mark Ventola and Jim Reedy will discuss back to work issues from the employment law perspective. Please visit the website to review the schedule and register for the webinars there. For today, we're less focused on the implementation of the stimulus law or the laws and emergency orders that have influenced employment issues. Those matters have rightly occupied a lot of space and probably most of your time over the past few weeks. And as I noted, future webinars will take up those matters again in detail. Today, as we hopefully inch towards a reopening of the economy, with John's expertise, we're going to turn our attention to the financial considerations that every company should be evaluating. John will look at this through the internal markers and strategies for focusing, or perhaps even refocusing, the company's operations in light of the great cessation of business. I'm going to then walk us through the considerations for doing business with financially distressed customers or suppliers, and the risks that might be associated with that business, and strategies for perhaps reducing those risks. John's going to share some final thoughts on the issues of reopening and what we should be considering as that occurs. And we will look to kind of evaluate those issues within the context of the financial model. As I said, the employment issues will be discussed on Friday. Please submit any questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to answer those questions during the course of this session. And finally, before turning the mic over to John, while the information in this webinar may include some general guidance, it is not intended, nor is it a substitute for legal advice. So without further delay, I welcome John Gilbert and turn it over to him to open our discussion today. There you go, John.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody this morning. My work is with business leaders, working on strategic operations, alignment and assessment and alignment with strategy. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about this morning, I don't think is new information, but it's really intended to try to get people to refocus on the things that are the most critical. So the title of this slide is Cash, Cash, and Cash. And, you know, as everybody knows, the conventional wisdom in businesses is that cash is king. And I think that that is particularly the issue, an issue of focus when we're in uncertain times, as we are certainly right now. A lot of businesses have experienced an extensive slowdown. I think the BIA just did a survey showing that 81% of its members had experienced fairly significant drop in revenue so far. So managing cash is really going to be critical. So the first thing that I would suggest people attend to is forecasting cash flow. And this is something this is a tool that many of you probably already use. But if you are not using it, it's a good time to start. And if you are using it, I think it's a good time to revisit it and start looking at it from a scenario perspective to say, you know, what happens if revenue drops by this much? What happens if, you know, our suppliers can't deliver on time and things like that? So I would recommend that you do at least 3 months in a weekly view, 6 months if you can afford the time to set it up. Because it's really important to be able to look out ahead of what's going to be coming as the business is going along. I don't think that it's worth getting terribly wrapped around the axle in terms of a very detailed analysis right down to the penny on things. I think if you have estimates of your revenue and estimates of your expenses, it should be enough. So I would suggest using your AR history and analyzing that to predict the rate at which revenue is going to flow into the business. I mean, obviously, if you're a retail business, it's a transactional revenue, and you can kind of estimate what your weekly revenue has been from your daily receipt history. Obviously, it's important to account for any seasonality in your business. If you're going to bill monthly, then the analysis is different, really based on more on your typical billing and collection cycles. I do think that it's important, as you're making these revenue estimates, to take some judgment against what your history has been and make some assumptions about what it's going to look like going forward, or what it may look like going forward, in terms of both the amount of revenue that's coming in and the timing with which it's going to arise. I think then it's important to estimate your routine expenses: rent, mortgage, utilities, payroll, cost of goods sold, as a ratio versus revenue, and then put those things into the individual weeks when they're going to occur in any given month. And that will allow you then to see how cash flow is going to cycle up and down, as you go through the next few months. Another important point of this is in cash flow forecasting is to update with actuals as that actual information comes in. So as you have real revenue information, as you have actually paid expenses, put those actual numbers in so that the forecast as it runs forward will become more reliable in terms of what's actually going to happen. And then I suggest using the forecast very actively, reviewing it frequently, particularly when you're about to make decisions about paying AP. It will be very important to be able to kind of see what the implications are of paying something this week as opposed to next week, and it may come down to that for some businesses, at least for the next few months. So if we could move to the next slide, Andrew. And then in terms of internal business management, I think you have to be monitoring your business activity very closely. And this is obviously very related to what we were just talking about in terms of cash flow forecasting. But I would suggest that from a forward-looking perspective, tracking your sales activity is really going to be a critical indicator of how things are going to look for you coming forward. And it may influence how you forecast your incoming revenue cycles. So tracking your sales activity, including the size of your pipeline, the length of your sales cycle, is it taking longer for sales to close? Are close rates dropping? All of those things are going to be important in terms of giving you a future indicator of what may happen in your business. With regard to revenue, you want to be looking at trends versus history. It's clearly an important element in cash flow forecasting, especially to the degree that it's going to be below expectations. So being able to look at those trends as they're developing and use that judgment in your cash flow forecast going forward is really critical. From an AR perspective, you want to be looking for trends of increasing length of time to payment. Again, this is an important element in your cash flow forecasting and for managing perhaps staff levels to the degree that the number of people in your organization are indexed against the level of your activity. From an expense perspective, you want to be looking for increases in pricing that are due to shortages of certain supplies or difficulties in delivery logistics. That will influence cash flow forecasting clearly, and it may prompt the need to look for alternative sources of important materials to try to keep costs in a reasonable range and a manageable level. Many institutions these days are offering opportunities to defer payments. Some of the banks have allowed for there to be 2 or 3 months grace on a mortgage or on a business loan of some kind, and simply tacking it on to the end of the nominal term of those agreements. So I would look into those offerings and the associated costs if there are any. You could also consider asking your suppliers to extend or lengthen their payment cycles if that would help you. The other thing that would be worth looking into, I think, is if you are maintaining funded reserves or escrows, it may be worth revisiting those governing agreements in consultation with the parties to those agreements to see whether it's rational to reduce those amounts in some way and free up more cash for operating purposes. As an example, you may have reached an agreement on a reserve for environmental issues as part of a transaction. And it may be that you're 5 years into that period now, and revisiting those estimates of costs is a worthwhile thing to do to see whether those reserves can be reduced. I mean, obviously, I'm not suggesting that you just start using reserve funds without consulting with people and getting a revised agreement in place, because that's not a healthy way to do business. From a supply chain perspective, you want to stay in very close communication with your suppliers and your vendors. regarding issues that they may have that could limit their production or their delivery of the things that you need to make your business work. And it's probably important to start identifying alternative sources of supply in the event that you have choke points develop. Many folks out there have taken advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program loans that are available, and those loans are great. They give a real boost to businesses in the short term, but it is important to realize that there is a cost associated with those loans if you are not able to manage them in such a way that you can get all or a large portion of them forgiven. So if you have one of these loans, it's really critical that you be tracking activities in detail from the date of disbursement. The guidance, at least as it's evolved so far, suggests that it's the date of disbursement that's going to control, which is not going to exactly match most payroll cycles in all likelihood. So you want to be tracking very closely, hours that people have worked or the days that they have worked, so that you'll be able to make the demonstrations that will be important to qualifying you for as much forgiveness as you can practically achieve. So I've talked a little bit fairly quickly about some of the importance of monitoring AR and collection cycles, among other things. And Chris is going to talk now about important things to do if you start to see troubling patterns developing.
Great. Thank you, John. Right, so John's just taken us through kind of the internal, what I'm calling the internal kind of considerations, but naturally they have some external elements as well. And while we're always basically advising clients and companies to manage and be carefully attending to supply chain and vendor issues, you need to keep in mind that we're in a massive succession right now of business, and there are going to be issues. And as John alluded to a couple times in his presentation, that communication is going to be critical. So while there have been issues in the past, perhaps, or this is a valued relationship, you can expect there to be bumps in the road in the near future. And so the advice generally is going to be take a step back, make sure you're communicating, and make sure that you have relationships that you can feel relied upon and trusted upon and go back to in terms of making sure that all parties are on the same page. And this relates to vendors, it relates to secured lenders, it relates to landlords, it relates to everybody. So while my presentation today is generally focused on customers and suppliers, keep in mind that the advice these days is just to keep as much transparency as possible, and communication will remain a critical piece of doing business in the future. As we relate to customer needs and suppliers, I think the message is generally going to be, you're going to have to be adaptable. There are things out there that are going to occur during the course of the next several weeks or even months, and making sure you're adaptable to customer needs is going to be critical. As each one of these relates to your ongoing business, you're going to have to consider them in the context of payment and supply risks. And so if you're evaluating your customer issues and supply issues and you're starting to see AR issues, as John had mentioned, you may need to implement a plan for repayment. Those payment plans may be different than what you've been accustomed to in the past. So you need some flexibility in that there. As it relates to supply chain, we're already seeing situations where clients and businesses are considering acquisition opportunities. So where the supply risk may be too much or a burden upon your own business, there may be opportunities within the business community to kind of look at acquiring either assets or entire entities to shore up some of those supply risks. As John mentioned, it's also worthwhile to consider different kind of channels as well to kind of make sure your business stays strong. Next slide, Andrea. So as we look at customers and doing business with financially distressed customers or vendors or suppliers for that matter, I kind of look at it in two time frames. You have to look at it kind of pre-bankruptcy or pre-insolvency event, and then a post-bankruptcy or an insolvency event of some sort. The options that you may have will be influenced by these two kind of event histories. So let's say you've learned that a key customer or supplier is in financial distress. They haven't filed bankruptcy yet, but it might be imminent. What should you do? there always is the kind of concern that there should be some sort of panic move at that point to start to kind of shore up whatever defenses and collections options you may have. But while you should recognize the severity of the problem, terminating your relationship with a troubled company or acting too quickly may not always be in your best interest. You may need to act quickly to implement some strategies, such as UCC commercial code, Uniform Commercial Code, excuse me, gives you some remedies that might require some immediate action. But as a practical matter, you might want to, and especially in light of the current situation, take a step back and have an opportunity to kind of evaluate where we are. And so that first bullet point, do your own due diligence. So you've got valued relationships and those should be protected. So just basing your approach on whether or not you hear that an entity is in a struggling position or is distressed, you might want to take the moment to do your own due diligence and figure out whether or not that's accurate. So sometimes rumors of financial distress are false, or they may be related to a matter that is unrelated specifically to that company. They might have a contract issue with another party or something like that. So the advice is to do your own due diligence. Again, relates back to the communication key. So check in with your clients and your customers, make sure that you understand what the actual situation is. If you do learn that the situation is not good and that the company is distressed, you do have some options. One of them may be reclaiming your goods. Under the Uniform Commercial Code, if you recently shipped goods to a distressed company, you may have the option to recover them. That requires a letter of demand and pretty quick action. So again, relating back to what John said, you need to kind of monitor this stuff and monitor it very carefully and closely. The next point is, have you recently received a payment? So when you're dealing with a distressed customer and you're worried about a potential bankruptcy, many of you are probably familiar with preferential transfer law. So that law, in a very quick fashion, is where you have received a payment within 90 days of the customer's bankruptcy. You may ultimately receive a letter a year or even 2 years from that bankruptcy asking for the money back. So preferential transfer law is a risk that we all have to deal with when we're dealing with distressed customers. The advice generally is continue to accept those payments, be aggressive in collection, but recognize that at a later date, there may be an issue that comes back and you may have to deal with a potential lawsuit. Andrew, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so if you have an issue with a customer that's in distress, should you file a lawsuit immediately? If you don't mind jeopardizing your relationship with that party, possibly pushing the debtor into bankruptcy, or even possibly pushing it into bankruptcy, sorry, you should consider a prompt lawsuit. Although I will say in today's economic situation, courts are going to be a little bit slow, reluctant, and there may be some mitigating factors of what you may be able to achieve through a lawsuit. Should you keep selling to the debtor? Again, a business decision that requires careful monitoring. You could modify the payment terms, make it even shorter payment terms, cash on delivery, things of that nature. But again, as John mentioned earlier, you need to monitor this stuff very carefully. And if you have a debtor or a customer who has changed their payment history, I would strongly suggest that you take a look at what is happening, stay in communication, and if payment terms need to be modified, implement them sooner rather than later. Okay, now, if you have a long-term contract with the buyer, as John mentioned again, you should be reviewing those contracts. Consider demanding adequate assurance of future performance. You may want to look at your options for terminating that contract or amending that contract in a manner that gives you greater protection. Okay, Andrea, can you go to the next slide? So those items that I just mentioned are kind of the pre-bankruptcy elements or options that you may have. If an entity files bankruptcy, as many of you probably know, there's something called an automatic stay, and the case kind of comes to a grinding halt, at least initially, in terms of your collection options. So some of those aggressive techniques of filing a lawsuit or terminating contracts, those rights may be curtailed by the actual bankruptcy process. So once you're in a bankruptcy setting, you might need to consider different approaches. Your collection ability has now been limited. You're subject to the bankruptcy laws. But what can you do? So the first one is, identified here, is can you collect your goods recently shipped? Again, that right still does exist. So if you have learned of a bankruptcy filing, you may have the ability to have the goods that you shipped returned. It is a tough process. It's a reclamation demand, and often a secured lender may already have an interest in those goods, and so it might be impossible to get them back. However, a demand should be made, and the bankruptcy code allows for a greater priority for those recently shipped goods. So there's a difference between the amounts owed for a longer term debt versus the things that were just sent recently. Should you continue to sell to the debtor? Well, the bankruptcy code usually provides protection to post-bankruptcy sales, meaning that a debtor in bankruptcy is supposed to continue to pay as it goes along, and that you should have protection there. That said, there are always risks that a company that is in Chapter 11 bankruptcy, an operating entity, could ultimately fail and end up in Chapter 7, and that those goods that you've been selling post-bankruptcy would also become subject to a claim. So the advice is be careful what you do during the course of the bankruptcy. The bankruptcy code typically would allow for sales to continue and to be paid in full for those. The pre-bankruptcy sales will still remain as a claim against the debtor, but that is the process. Once a bankruptcy is filed, you may also want to consider whether or not you can be designated a critical vendor. A critical vendor is kind of an improved position of a general unsecured creditor. If you're a critical vendor, sometimes you will get your pre-bankruptcy payments made, and that is when a debtor tells the court, bankruptcy court, that we have a situation where this vendor is absolutely critical to my work, and so I need to pay them both for some of the pre-bankruptcy as well as continuing to pay them as we go along. Obviously, being designated a critical vendor is an important option. If you have a long-term contract with the debtor, this is a similar question that was raised in the pre-bankruptcy, you may have some issues. The debtor has certain assumption rights provided by the contract and provided by the bankruptcy code, and sometimes those are not always consistent. So a bankruptcy code will often override certain rejection rights and termination rights that a party may have. In the context of a bankruptcy and a party to a contract, what you're hoping will occur is that your contract rights will be assumed in the bankruptcy. Assumption means that your pre-bankruptcy amount would be cured. So again, if you have a long-term contract and you're aware of the debtor, make sure you look at that, make sure you stay on top of the options, and if assumption of your rights is an option, that would be the preferred method of getting paid for outstanding amounts. If you learn of a bankruptcy, frequently you may get a notice from the bankruptcy court asking if you want to serve on a creditors committee. That group would then be the party that represents the general unsecured creditors. So it gives them a seat at the table for negotiating in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy process. So if you're invited to serve on the creditors committee, you might want to look into whether or not the matter is worth your time and energy in terms of pursuing the claim that's owed to you, and whether or not you want to invest the time administratively and with the process in order to see whether or not your group of creditors would be better served and could get a better return out of a bankruptcy system. At this time, those are kind of just, very cursory, very over the top views of looking at what you can do in terms of your recovery options and what issues you should consider in terms of dealing with distressed customers. But it's very cursory and it requires a lot of attention. And at this point, I think what we'll do now is just turn it over back to John to discuss some of the issues that are going to occur as parties consider to reopen their business. John?
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to just take a couple of minutes as we're starting to talk about reopening of business and economic activity in the state and elsewhere in the country. I think there are some things that people need to start thinking about in practical terms. One is that this is obviously a collective responsibility. We've got to think about our responsibility to not only ourselves and our customers and our employees, but also the circles of people that they come into contact with. And it's important to recognize that at this stage, everyone really needs to be considered a potential source of infection. And negative results are really only meaningful for the day that they are obtained from testing, because anybody who's out and about could run into someone else who is infected and then become infected. And so at that point, the test results are not that useful. So a few suggestions. Prevention of contact is really the critical thing. And evaluating potential for exposure by roles within your business is important. And obviously there are different considerations for people that work at your site inside your facility as opposed to outdoor locations or in the facilities of others. Some things to think about, not obviously an exhaustive list, and it will need to be tailored to your particular situation, include in an on-site setting, limiting non-essential entry. Visitors, delivery staff, employees that can function remotely, try to limit the number of people that are actually coming into and entering your facility. Entry screening is important for symptoms, for temperature, testing if that becomes practical. I know that some requirements have been relaxed, allowing people to do this kind of screening for employees and people entering their workspaces, but it is very important that you remember that these are medical records and that they need to be separated and maintained separately from other employee records. And you have to be careful about informing people of potential exposure so that you're not identifying individuals necessarily who are the sources. Off-site, the things to be thinking about are maintaining physical distance, particularly between your staff or your workers and your customers, people who are not on your team. And in the use of protective equipment. From a prevention standpoint, it's also important to think about those kinds of controls that you can implement on a larger scale. So ventilation and increasing the number of air changes in your workspaces, your internal workspaces, is something that might be useful in terms of reducing the concentration of virus if it's in the air. Sanitation. Thinking about increasing the frequency of cleaning, particularly of shared equipment, doors, tables and countertops, washroom facilities, and so on, is a really critical step in this, I think, because the concern would be touching a contaminated surface and then, bringing your hands to your eyes or to your face. Maintaining physical spacing and separation, using barriers where it's possible. Think about workstations, office spaces, how you're going to manage this in retail locations, manufacturing, warehouse spaces, and to the degree that you can, closing any common areas within your facilities, I think is probably a good initial first step until there's a better handle on the progression of the pandemic. Then the last point that I would make is that the workforce is likely to be volatile. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. Unemployment has exploded over the last several weeks as people have had to furlough or lay off employees. And employees may take that opportunity to make changes, which can affect your retention and hiring. So you need to be thinking through very carefully how you're going to manage potentially higher rates of turnover in terms of your hiring and retention practices. I think that communicating frequently and transparently with your employees about what's going on and what the plans are is really critical because that helps to reduce anxiety. And you need to think about the fact that in addition to whatever anxiety they have about their own employment, they're thinking about children at home, elderly folks in their family, a spouse's loss of employment. The anxiety levels are already ramped up, and anything that you can do to reduce them when it comes to your situation and your relationship with your staff will be helpful, I think. And then you could also consider augmenting pay for people that are in key roles for the duration of this pandemic, so that you're not losing some of your critical players right in the middle of the most difficult times. So we pretty well have chewed through our time this morning, and I personally would like to thank Chris and she and Finney for the opportunity to address you. We haven't got a lot of time, like maybe we're out of time for questions, but we will be able to respond to questions after the webinar ends as well. We'll get a written transcript and be able to get back to you individually to respond to your questions or concerns. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Chris for the final word.
Thanks, John. And that final slide and that final presentation is a good lead in to the next webinar, which will happen on Friday, which is, again, as I mentioned before, with Mark Ventola and Jim Reedy on Friday morning at 11 a.m., dealing with the employment perspective on some of these back to work issues. So thank you, John, for raising those here, and they'll get even further discussion, I'm sure, on Friday morning. So thank you, John. I appreciate your taking the time to speak with us today. I thank you all for participating. We look forward to seeing you hopefully in person in the not too distant future, and hope you all stay well. Thank you all very much and have a good day.